In 2016, GoPro released the Session 5. Back then, FPV was still in its infancy, so I'm pretty sure it wasn't a consideration for the design. But by chance, it was like the glass slipper for FPV. It was the perfect form factor for our FPV drones. It was lightweight, it gave you full manual control over the image, and it was built like an absolute tank. It was the perfect fit. 2 years later, it was discontinued. This Session form factor was left to rot by GoPro, and they concentrated on the Hero line. Every year since, the FPV community has collectively prayed to the camera gods that this will be the time that GoPro brings the Session back. With all the advancements in sort of small sensor action cameras over the years, we've dreamed of like a GoPro Session shaped camera that can do 4K, hyper smooth, super view, and to this day, our prayers have been left unanswered. Enter DJI, a company better known for drones, but arguably has had more success making action cameras than GoPro has making drones. They recently announced, and have now released, on paper at least, the answer to our prayers. It's got 4K 120 FPS, rock-steady stabilisation, ultra-wide field of view, full manual control. It even throws in a fully functional touchscreen, something the Session never had and we would have never considered an essential. And it manages to do all that while being half the size of the Session and lighter. Now, it does sound too good to be true, and it probably is. So let's take a closer look. In the box, you get the camera that can operate standalone with an inbuilt battery. You get about half an hour recording on it and a modest amount of built-in storage. You get an extra module that's either a power or screen module, depending on which version of the camera you bought. Both have an extra battery that can be used to charge the camera in the field, and an SD card slot that can be used to transfer footage from the internal memory or be recorded straight onto. The only difference I can see is that one has a screen, and that's pretty much irrelevant for FPV. The one I've got here is the screen one, that's the one the shop sent me. But if you are looking to buy one, I would say get the power module one, because I think the battery will last a little bit longer and there's really no need for the screen. It is basically marketed as a front screen, and that's really all it is. It has exactly the same functionality as the rear screen that's already on the camera. So unless you plan to use this for vlog style filming, it has no benefit over the power module. You also get some magnetic accessory things. On first glance, this sort of magnetic approach to accessories and this kind of modular design as well does seem very Insta360-esque, and they definitely seem to have taken some inspiration there. There's a few magnetic mount type things in the box, but this is a freestyle FPV channel, and I ain't trusting no flimsy magnets to hold up the crashes. So I designed a TPU mount for my Superfly Juice Mode frame, and it only took me 7 attempts to get it right, but we got there in the end. So now the camera's on the drone. That brings us to probably what you're here to see, which is the footage. This won't be a full breakdown of every setting on the camera. There's plenty of reviews already that cover that. I just wanted to focus on 4 areas that I think have some value to add to the conversation. Now, depending on your style, this may or may not be important, but it's undeniable that stabilisation is a valid tool. So it's important to look at DJI's ROCKsteady. Now, we'll be subjective for a minute, so take the next sentence with a pinch of salt. But personally, I never moved on from the GoPro Hero 7 for the longest time, because I love the look of the original Hypersmooth 1.0. To my eyes, it improves like minor imprecisions and allows for like a cleaner encode, but still keeps a lot of the character of flight intact. The future versions of Hypersmooth sort of gravitate towards this aggressively smooth image, and I think the Action 2 falls into that category as well with the ROCKsteady. It smooths to the point that freestyle sort of loses some personality. Your flying looks springy rather than sharp. Objectively though, there's definitely issues with the stabilisation. It looks like there are jello artifacts when there are sort of more aggressive movements, and you can see it pretty clearly in this footage, just walking with the camera, not even flying. So this could probably ruin a perfectly good shot and does have me not wanting to rely on the stabilisation. I've seen similar artifacts on the GoPro 8 in boost mode, and it does seem that stabilisation that tries to sort of do more can often exhibit these problems. I can't explain why, I just don't know. Perhaps if you had a higher shutter speed, you might have a better chance, but then you lose that kind of eye-pleasing motion blur. Even if it worked flawlessly though, I can't really say it is an effect that I want overall. It's too squishy for freestyle flying. There is also Horizon Steady. That's definitely not something you want for freestyle though. Obviously all your rolls and all your tricks would just be, would just not exist. So for cinematic, it might be something that would give you a REELSTEADY-like look without the post-processing, which does sound compelling, but not really the focus of this video. Holy shit, this thing is wide, like ridiculously so. There's 3 settings to choose from when it comes to the field of view. There's ultra wide, wide, and standard de-warp. Starting at the widest, I couldn't actually get like a good flight on the widest setting without getting a substantial part of my mountain shot. But just from walking around with it, I found it uncomfortably wide. It's not corrected in any way, so the distortion on the image is like almost nauseating. Objects at the center of the screen seem like really far away, like miles away, a really strong reverse binocular effect, I think I would call it. The only mode that does try and correct for fisheye distortions is the standard mode, which has what they call de-warp that linearizes the image. So standard and wide have a kind of similar FOV, with standard being slightly less due to the de-warping process. It'll be personal taste which one you prefer, but I think either of those are probably wide enough for 99% of situations. It just feels a bit like the ultra wide was there so they could have a bigger number than GoPro for the FOV. I think the GoPro tops out at 140 degrees, but remember GoPro's super view stretches the image in a unique way, meaning that the center of the frame doesn't get distorted, like the edges get more distorted, but it negates the reverse binocular effect, because the middle is kind of left untouched. So 155 degrees with no super view trickery is basically impractical in my opinion. The image is actually pretty damn good. There's none of that aggressive digital sharpening you often find on cheaper cameras to trying to mask their sort of cheap components. Here it's a really solid image, built on a good quality sensor and good optics. It has manual exposure control, which is implemented in a really nice way. It's the first tiny action camera I've seen to have an actual EV monitor readout on the screen, which is super useful when you're trying to find the right ND filter. The sensor is larger than the GoPro, so this should be better in low light situations, but it doesn't actually seem to translate quite that way. It seems to be way less sensitive to light, even though it's larger. It's like the only thing I can think of is the ISO is cranked way down. If you compare with my usual GoPro Hero 7, they both have a 2.8 aperture lens, setting identical shutter speed and ISO. The image was far more underexposed on the Action 2. But on the flip side, you can crank the ISO way higher on the Action 2 and still maintain a usable image, probably because of the larger sensor, but anything over about 400 on the GoPro creates a very noisy picture. But then you need to crank it to match the exposure of the GoPro. So overall, I think it might actually be about the same in terms of low light performance. I don't know. It's tough to call, but it's not like a good low light camera. All that being said, we can't talk about the image quality without bringing up the real negative point with this camera, the real deal breaker for me. God damn it, DJI. This was supposed to be the one. Oh, it had everything going for it on paper. Have you noticed anything weird about the footage shown so far? Maybe you've seen some other videos out there, and I invite you to go check them again if you have, and see if you agree. But does some of the image look kind of too dark, but at the same time, some areas seem like they're blowing out? This is because of the dynamic range, or more accurately, a lack of. What makes this worse for the Action 2 is most cameras have like a log or a flat profile, which gives you the whole range and it sort of flattens it out, so less areas of the image are under and overexposed. It lets you adjust the image in post more to your liking, and it means that you can add contrast yourself without like blowing out the whites or crushing the blacks too much. If that's done on camera, then obviously that information is lost. So a flat profile is kind of like, it's an essential, I think, personally. Now, I don't actually know the dynamic range stops on the Action 2. It may be comparable to the GoPro. We may never know, as there's no way to get a flat image out of the camera. It does have 2 color profiles. There is standard and D-Cine-like, but even the D-Cine-like profile is anything but flat. It seems to remove saturation, but the contrast still seems to be very high and baked into the image. So here's a comparison where you can see how much flatter the GoPro images looks than the sort of flatter Cine-like profile on the Action 2. This means that challenging lighting like bright sun and shadows kind of pose a real challenge for it. And this point alone is a big enough problem for me to not change to the Action 2 full time. But it may be possible to fix. If it is as simple as the sensor's dynamic range is just being nerfed by the color profile on the camera, then there's every possibility DJI will add a flatter profile in a firmware update. I've seen it happen on cameras before, like my G9, which added a log profile for a firmware update about a year after it launched. So I will be keeping an eye on updates from DJI on the Action 2, and I do hope that they can fix this one. maybe you don't care about stabilization. Maybe you don't care about dynamic range. Do you just stick the exposure on auto? Don't faff around with ND filters or any of that stuff? This camera is still ticking all the boxes for you. So in that case, you probably fly hard. So this is the one that means a lot to you. The biggest issue here is this big old piece of glass on the lens. It's non-replaceable, and it is a really big target for metal poles or trees to cause some damage. All GoPros, with the exception of the 8, have this part as like a removable piece for a few quid, but there doesn't seem to be an easy way to replace this one. There is a potential fix for this though. With the Hero 8, a company called Camera Batter stepped up and offered replacement kits with glass that you can fit with just a heat gun to remove the old broken one. And I have spoke to him and can confirm he is working on a kit for the Action 2. So that is very good news, and certainly gives me an easier time recommending this thing who just want to rip full beans on full auto. Even so, maybe get some ND2s or ND4s just to give it an extra layer of protection so you don't have to change the glass quite as often. Outside of that, with a good TPU mount, I didn't have any issues with like recording stopping or corrupting files after taking a few hits, and I do always crash, so that wasn't too difficult to test. Well, those were the things that mattered most to me. There are a couple more general things that are still important to mention though. Battery life. It's not amazing on the internal battery alone, around 25 minutes of 4K 30 on the device. You can ensure you're getting the most out of it. There is an option which is screen off when recording, so enable that in the settings. But when it's running low, it's quick and simple to plug it into the external module to give it a boost. This also lets you transfer footage from the camera to the SD card in the module, but get used to looking at this screen a lot when doing so. It seems around 15 minutes of 4K 30 footage took around 15 minutes to transfer. So transfer times are basically real time. On the plus side though, that will also charge your battery while it's doing that. So when I did 15 minutes of footage, it got from 20% back up to 100%. So although you may have to plan your day around it a bit, if you go into multiple spots, just stick it on the module, start the transfer when you're traveling to the next spot. It actually doesn't seem too bad. It's not really the end of the world. And actually there is a positive to this approach. No ND card on the actual camera that you put on your drone, which means one less thing to break if you get in a crash. And if the worst thing happened and you lost the drone completely, or it went into the ocean or something, you have like been forced to make backups through the whole day. So that's no bad thing. One last little point is there have been some reports of overheating, but I think this is more of a general use thing. Realistically, if you're flying through the air at 60 miles an hour, you're giving it a really nice amount of airflow. So I didn't really see any issues there. Vlogging with it might be a different story, mind you. You have to watch a regular tech channel if you want more information on that use case though. So we've got to wrap up this video, and there is a lot to love about the Action 2. It's genuinely innovative. It packs in like more features than it has any right to at this size. We never thought it'd be possible, to be honest. It feels like DJI keep doing that, right? Digital FPV, yeah, it's impossible. Oh, they did it. A GoPro session size camera with hyper smooth and 4K 120 this does. That's insane. Yeah, a lot to love. And it looks like it belongs on a quad. Its form factor means there's like no stupid looking top heavy off balance thing. And the lens is finally like back in the middle of the quad where it belongs. But for me, that dynamic range is a real deal breaker. The flat color profile is laughably unflat when it comes to the contrast. It just desaturates the image, leaving the white still blowing out and the black still getting crushed. You could argue if you're happy just sticking it on auto exposure and having the exposure like go up and down as you go through shadows and sunlight, and you don't use stabilization, then this camera is perfect. But the price of entry is £350. So you expect these things to be great. You expect everything to be great. The good news is stabilization updates can be done in firmware, as it's purely electronic stabilization, and dynamic range issues potentially could be something that could be sorted in firmware updates as well, if it is an image handling thing and not a limitation of the sensor itself. So there is hope that this could become the does everything for everyone FPV camera of choice. But for now, I'm probably going to be sticking to my trusty GoPros for that dynamic range issue alone. I hope you got something out of this video. I hope there was some information there that you didn't know before, and maybe it has weighted your opinion on whether you want to get one of these or not. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Leave a comment down below what you think of the Action 2, if you think it is great or terrible or somewhere in between. Love to know. Very interested to see how many FPV people pick this up and start using it as their main camera. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, subscribe, all that good YouTube stuff, and I'll see you in the next one.